In the beginning, there weren't people. Then there were, and they were probably outrunning predators on the regular. After a while, once they got better at dealing with the predators with less running, they were outrunning each other, some of which were still predators. I mean, just look at the voice acting and film industries. Eventually, some jackass took the corners off a square, and after some trial and error, with ideal rounded square combinations for stability's sake, and striving them to progressively larger animals and machines, we got automotive racing. As for where I'm going with this intro, I'm not entirely sure. Welcome to Cinations, which should hopefully be a relatively long-running look at all sorts of different racing games. Primarily the arcadey and karty sort of ones, because that's where my base of knowledge is, but we're going to go all over the place. As for this episode, I decided we should start with something fairly rudimentary and a good example of the roots of the racing game genre, at least as it's known in the post-console era. I mean, of course, Smurf Racer. Yeah, you were probably expecting Super Mario Kart, but we'll get to that one day. I mean, there's quite a lot of it. But no, really, Smurf Racer. Plopping on the PlayStation the system's swan song days, it may have only received middling reviews as an unanticipated mascot racer, and one not particularly noteworthy or well documented to boot, but it's also a stark distillation of core kart racer elements, and landed at a time in gaming writ large that may explain its failure to be more than a blip. Before we move on, here's a quick primer for anyone who might not know what a Smurf actually is. Created by Belgian cartoonist Peyo in 1958 in another one of his comics, the Smurfs themselves got their own series in 1959, and merchandise here and there, the biggest line of which was a line of plastic figurines that released in the 1970s. They're little blue guys with white caps and pants, little blue tails, and their personalities, as much as they have them, are based on various real-world personality traits, and in many cases, different occupations. They live in a isolated but idyllic little utopia, operating under the advice and leadership of a scholarly type with a penchant for red and a beard. La 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 la. Seriously, they had an entire episode that was anti-capitalist. This isn't exactly subtle. In 1981, Hanna-Barbera released a Saturday morning cartoon featuring the Smurfs after some of the merchandise and cartoons made their way across the Atlantic, and it was big. Lots of merchandising. I distinctly remember having Smurfs bed sheets, and there were toys, plushes, you name it, it probably got made. The series' main run ended in 1989, and while it lived on in reruns and then further syndication after that, Smurf merchandise kind of dialed back down to a trickle. But it wasn't that big a deal and remained mostly a memory till the reboot film series that first released in 2011. So, as implied, 2001, not that Smurfy a year. Really not that much justification for a Smurf tie-in kart game. Sure, there was one episode that I can recall, the entire series, the Smurf Box Derby, that featured Smurfs in automobiles, but for the most part, there's really no point of reference here. It'd be another decade before, well, whatever the hell this is.
Whoa, is there a draft in here?
Nothing like a cool breeze through my enchanted forest.
I think I just smurfed in my mouth.
Would come out. So, why make a Smurfs racing game? Well, it's probably because at that point, everyone else was doing it. This was the beginning of a fairly sizable boom in kart racers, especially on the PlayStation system. Back in August of '98, Bomberman Fantasy Race came out. Not quite karty, but definitely mascotty. And then in March of '99, we had Chocobo Racing hot on its heels. Both those titles came out a little bit later in North America. Bomberman Fantasy Race hitting here in March of '99, and Chocobo Racing in August of '99. And then Crash Team Racing and LEGO Racers would both drop on the PlayStation in September and December of the same year. 2000 continued the trend with another burst, including Muppet Race Mania in October, and November's Looney Tunes Racing and Woody Woodpecker Racing. These are real. I've played them. And again, this count is just franchise kart racers in that period. So if we give Smurf Racer, or as it was released in Europe, 321 Smurf My First Racer, see what I did there, the benefit of the doubt in that more than 4 months were spent on development, the inspiration for this game likely came from either that first burst of games or from early announcements regarding the second batch. Either way, the game on the whole felt like too little, too late. You see, in between those two big spurts of kart racers, almost a year to the day ahead of Smurf Racer's release, we got a little thing called the PlayStation 2. Sure, the system had backwards compatibility, and the old system did get a fair amount of support in its twilight days, but track-based automotive racing fans already had Midnight Club to sate them on the PS2 by the time that Smurf Racer came out, and we had Crazy Taxi and Cool Boarders coming down the pipe for the PS2 in another month for those with slightly less traditional racing taste. So, with enough love and effort and a decent gameplay core behind it, you'd think a franchise as long-running and solid as the Smurfs would have produced a game that could have survived the test of time. Well, there's the rub right there. Smurfs were doing okay and all, if not very prominently, but the gameplay core, kind of not there. As I said earlier, it's a distillation of the most core elements of kart racing, but that's about all it is. The first, and at the time only, racing game developed by Quebecois game studio Artificial Minded Movement, previously and subsequently known as Behaviour Interactive, which we'll get to. Smurf Racer did a great job of doing its homework in regards to its source material. Aside from Brainy Smurf, your in-game guide, and the last person who should be left in charge of anything Smurfy, judging by the episode King Smurf.
Well, how the mighty have fallen. Shark! Plug that gap! Stop those rebels! Lift that!
Sounding nothing like his animated series version.
Stop the game! Continue the game!
Most everything else is legit. The initial 8 characters are all from the show's core cast or prominently featured Smurfs from later seasons, and even 3 of the 4 unlockable Smurfs are, despite my initial lack of recognition of them, also from canon episodes of the show. So as for the game itself, you can listen to Brainy narrate pretty much every option in the menu, all of the tutorial stuff, which just explains what all the items do, and even all the different button options, which, again, they were aiming for a kid audience, so I can kind of understand why they would have him clarifying every single thing. Once you decide to get into the game itself, you get to choose between easy and expert difficulty, the number of players, and what type of game you want to play. The options presented are single race, which lets you play pretty much any track you've unlocked up to that point, championship, which is what you need to play to unlock all those options, and flag race, which we'll get out of the way now because it's just one course, it's the game's battle mode, and you're kind of collecting flags and shooting at each other on the moon. There's no other tracks for this one, and while it's kind of fun, especially in 2-player, there really isn't that much there. Once you get through the mode choice and everything, then the due diligence done by A2M begins to shine. As mentioned earlier, your initial 8 options are all fairly well-known Smurfs, all of which are driving vehicles styled after things appropriate to their characters. Papa Smurf's driving a book, Jokey Smurf has one of his presents converted into a vehicle, Handy Smurf has a screwdriver, Cook Smurf has what looks to be a frying pan, Painter Smurf has a tube of paint, Smurfette's driving what looks like a shoe? I'm not sure what's going on there, and is Hefty Smurf driving an artillery shell? That's just not good. To unlock the other 4 Smurfs, you have to finish first place in championship mode in the last race in each area and the bonus stage Astro Smurfs Challenge. Said challenge, of course, nets you Astro Smurf, which was pulled from the episode, the Astro Smurf, who is technically a figment of Dreamy's imagination. Victory on the course in the trees gets you Wild Smurf, whose wooden car reflects his history as the Smurf's equivalent of Tarzan, having been raised by wild animals and found in the wild. First place in Gargamel's lab unlocks the one original character in this game, Superdrive Smurf, and his Sporty Sprout spoilered speedster. And the final unlock is... oh no.
King Smurf! I see him, but I don't believe him!
But yeah, King Smurf is also playable, which is kind of odd since Brainy is still there the entire time, but I'm done asking questions. So, despite all the variety in this cast, none of these characters play remotely different from one another. They all have different items they drop behind them as their defensive quote-unquote weapon, but they all do the same thing. They apply the same amount of slide and spin out to whoever hits them, and the only differences are cosmetic. For instance, Papa Smurf drops a vial of some sort of alchemical magic science goo, Cook Smurf drops a cake, and Hefty Smurf will drop an Acme brand 10-ton weight. But again, all the same amount of damage. Everyone accelerates the same, they steer the same, and everybody has access to the same forward-firing firecracker mushrooms that are scattered along the course. Sure, the game is geared towards children and beginners, but by this point, we've had enough kart racers with slight, weight and acceleration differences that you would think designers would realize at least minor tweaks like this aren't too hard to get used to. Or it could have been something they introduced in the expert mode while keeping it nixed from the easy mode. Really, all expert mode does to the drivers is make them drive more aggressively and attack a bit more frequently. Despite this shortcoming, looking at the courses, we have another decent stack of Smurfy references. The first region, set around the Smurf village itself, has a drive through the Smurf village, a drive around the frequently revisited dam protecting the Smurf village, and one set in the trees, which is more of a general one, but they were up towards the canopy fairly frequently, so I'm not going to complain. The big castle area is the most amalgamated region because there are several castles that feature in the series, but there's one where you're driving in the snow around one where you're driving through a castle, and one where you're driving in the neighborhood around the castle, which I thought was at least a nice variety, despite them kind of mishmashing several castles together. As for the Forbidden Zone, that features areas where the Smurfs typically got in trouble. The Gloomy Swamp embodies the same swamp the Smurfs occasionally got in trouble in, but I'm not sure if that's the same name they used in the animated series for it. The Haunted Mansion as well is another amalgamated course, pulling inspiration from several haunted locations in the series. Gargamel's Laboratory is fairly true to the home of the Smurfs' recurring arch nemesis, but I'm kind of gutted they didn't involve Azrael, Gargamel's snickering cat, in any way, shape, or form in the course, at least not that I noticed. The expert mode adds a little more difficulty in the form of sectional time limits, which are broken up by checkpoints in the form of wind-up keys spinning parallel on either side of the track. This feels like an odd element to insert, as it's a holdover from arcade machine racers, which were designed to eat your quarter if you ran out of time during part of a race, rather than an element used in pretty much any kart racers up to that point, so it's not exactly easy to understand why the developers kept that in there. The additional aggression from the other players and maybe some extra course hazards would have made a little more sense. And really, that's kind of all there is to the game. You beat all the courses on easy mode, that'll unlock everything. Then you can go back in championship mode and get cups instead of laurels for your wins. That's it. The game does also save best times for each course, but that's really all that's tied to your file. All in all, this leaves Smurf Racer feeling a little bit half-baked. I'm not sure if it was a time constraint issue, if they were just trying to get this out the door, or if they didn't have the funding for it, but it feels like they could have done a little more. There isn't much documentation on Smurf Racer out there on the internet, and to be honest, I'd rather avoid too much conjecture over it. In fairness, the uniformity of the game does have a few advantages. First of all, it definitely lives up to the kid-friendliness the game seemed to have been going for, as it's pretty easy for kids to pick up, and the two-player mode makes it a great way to keep friends and siblings busy for a few hours. Secondly, the fact that there's not much variance to account for makes it relatively ripe for speedrunning. There are a handful of players on the leaderboard for Smurf Racer at speedrun.com, and the full run of the Expert Championship mode is running around half an hour right now. The battle for first in the game has turned into mostly shaving seconds off that 30-minute score, with the top score as of this recording being around 29 minutes and 41 seconds. If you feel like you've got what it takes, this game's dirt cheap on resale sites in its used form, so feel free to pick up a copy and give it a shot. As for Artificial Mind in Motion, the devs responsible for Smurf Racer, they kept trucking along with different games as the years went on. Mostly more tie-ins with existing properties, and a few original IPs that snuck in later. Racing as a genre would be avoided by A2M for a solid 8 years after Smurf Racer, until they released the vastly superior My Sims Racing for the Nintendo Wii and Nintendo DS in mid-2009. Seriously, this one's super fun, and a sign that taking that long of a break paid off quite a bit. If anything, it's probably going to get its own episode on this series down the line. And yes, I am quite aware that A2M has other meanings. That might be part of why they changed names back to Behaviour Interactive in 2010. But, yeah. If you made it this far, I'm glad you came along for a look at one of the most basic racing games ever released. There wasn't as much of a story behind it as I'd initially hoped, but it still stands as a lesson in how it doesn't matter how much referential attention to detail you wrap mediocre systems in, those systems will still prove to be mediocre. If you watch this and know anything about Smurf Racer I overlooked or got wrong, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Also, let me know if there are any particular racing games or series you'd like to see me cover in the future. I've got a pretty lengthy list as it is to sift through, with nearly 800 games, including ports and re-releases, but I'm probably missing something. Alright, here's where I try to name all the Smurfs I can remember off the top of my head. It's been a while, but I think we'll get a few of them out of this. Obviously, there's Papa Smurf, Smurfette, Brainy Smurf, the constant target of abuse. There's like a Brawny Smurf. He was strong. He had a tattoo. It was like a little heart with an arrow through it. He lifted things. That's mostly what I remember. I probably have the name wrong, but I know he definitely existed. Vanity Smurf? I think he had like a mirror or something. What else was there? Like Jokey Smurf. He had the explosive presence. Handy Smurf? Fix-It Smurf? Something like that. Wishy Smurf? I'm already running out of material here, so that's all I got.